So I'm going to talk about ocean research in support of sustainability, and particularly the ocean research that we in this IMBeR community do. And I think this community is advantageously placed for this work because you've got this unique advantage of having essentially very high-level biophysical, biogeochemical scientists working alongside social and policy scientists to co-create knowledge and transmit it for uptake in policy and to support decision-making. So I want to look a little bit about how we're going about that and where it fits into the evolving global ocean policy context. The work that I'm going to talk about comes largely from a whole set of work that's currently in progress. My background has been mainly in fisheries, but I've sort of, as time goes by, you broaden in some ways, and I've become involved much more in discussions around the future human relationship with the sea, the blue economy, and challenges to the blue economy. So the work that I'm currently doing involves working with World Fish, with a high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy, where I'm leading a writing of a blue paper, which looks at the diverse relationships that people have with the sea to try and situate the blue economy in that context. I'm also working with a follow-up to the Nereus program funded by the Nippon Foundation, which looks at the nexus between poverty reduction, inequality, environmental conservation, and the maritime economy. And I'm working with colleagues at Lancaster University, Christina Hicks and co, on environmental change and issues such as decolonizing marine science. And finally with MARE at Amsterdam, particularly Dr. Yuri Scholtens, who is heading a project looking at inequality at sea. So there's a series of these policy-facing initiatives, and the work I'm going to talk about is based really on this ongoing work. So it's not neat, packaged, finished research, but very much ongoing work, and I hope that resonates with your attempts this week to progress your own research into these policy domains. So the overarching question, and I should have said that what I wanted to do also was to thank all those people and organizations, people in those organizations for all the contributions that they've made to my thinking over the years. The question that I really want to focus on is how can IMBeR science support the social equity dimensions of sustainability? And I focus on the social equity dimension because my sense is that that one is the one that is least well articulated and least often researched in the current wave of enthusiasm for ocean sustainability research and sustainability policy and economic development from the oceans. So looking at the IMBeR mission statement or vision that Carol was talking about earlier, we know what IMBeR is now. It's an international project that, and I've highlighted a few words here, that promotes integrated marine research. So there is this sense of integrating across disciplines, across geographies, through a range of research topics towards sustainable, productive, and healthy oceans at a time of global change for the benefit of society. And those last words are the ones that I think are really interesting and important and perhaps least reflected upon. So the implication there is that somehow all research will benefit everybody equally. And of course we know that that's not necessarily the case, and I'm going to unpack a little bit of that during this talk. And any social scientist looking at the word society will say, well, how are you defining society? How are you addressing the structure of society, the different levels, how power operates, how different cultures interact? Is there just one society, or are there many societies? And we tend not to unpack that part, which, again, is a theme that I'll pick up during this talk. So in terms of what I want to cover, I want to look at IMBeR, and this is a real opportunity for IMBeR because we have this UN Decade for the Oceans, where, again, marine science is framed as a global public good. It's good for society, good for everyone. Oceans and Sustainable Development Goals, we've also got a link and an opportunity there to address some of the issues in society that have been flagged at the highest level, issues of poverty, hunger, gender discrimination, and a whole host of others. And the oceans have their own SDG, but what we do in ocean science, I think, is about much more than just life underwater. And we're also in this time where everyone's talking about the blue economy, the oceans as this economic frontier, as this the next provider of the major growth that the world requires if it continues on its sort of current system of organization to support a growing population with increasing aspirations. And I want to raise this issue of social inequality. Why is it a problem for ocean sustainability? And then to go under that, to ask the question, who in society does marine science serve? Who has it served in the past? To look a little bit at some of the history of marine science and what it's been used for in the past. And finally, to finish beyond the blue economy, how can science support not just economic prosperity and sustainable economic growth, but the wider set of values that we have in our relationships with the sea and with the environment more generally. That's a lot to cover, so some of this will be quite quick and superficial, and other things I'll be able to go into a little bit more detail. But I am around all week, so please, anything that you want to discuss further, then please do come and talk to me. So the IMBeR Science Plan you've heard about in Carol's presentation, and so this is the kind of short, the graphical version. And I looked at the graph and I thought, well, I need to add some words to interpret the graphics. I love the graphics, but when I tried to look at them without looking at the words, I sort of came up with a whole bunch of other potential interpretations. We seem to be running out of time to sequence the Cuban genome, I think, there. Somebody has got the world's problems on their mind and dropped their laptop in the sea and just lost that fantastic graph that would have got them published in Nature. That seal is super stressed there. I think it's only got 1 bar on its Wi-Fi. It must be a millennial. And there's 2 white men shaking hands there, hoping to make a pile of money by privatizing the sea. So that bit is actually the bit about equity that connects with history and that is concerning to many. If you look at 2 white men, or did indeed shake hands in 1494, the kings of Portugal and Spain, and the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the spheres of influence over the known navigated oceans by those European powers at the time between those two countries. And it was indeed a challenge to that by the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius during the age of mercantilism, when people were trying to expand and develop trading networks and empires, that treaty was challenged, and the idea of freedom of the seas was enshrined in our sort of legal systems. And that eventually led to the whole law of the sea process and the current designation that we have of the high seas as the common heritage of mankind, not belonging to any one nation, but belonging to all of us. And so that regime, of course, has long historical roots, and the inequities that it has created also has those long historical roots. And it's important to understand some of those as we move forward with this current aim to transform the governance of the ocean through, as the blue economy often proposes, by privatizing or moving towards a greater privatization of what are currently either the common property of states or the common property of the globe. I mentioned the UN Decade for Ocean Science, and this is how it's thinking, rather along similar lines to IMBeR, the same sorts of activities and words, hence the synergies. Looking at this through a sort of more social science lens, the activities tend to be scientific ones. There's building capacity as well, raising public awareness. So there's the idea of the science to policy pipeline, generating science to inform sustainable development. And then it has a series of outcomes which it calls societal outcomes, but which I think many social scientists would regard as environmental prerequisites for some kind of social policy. And what's missing, I think, from the Decade of Ocean Science is what that kind of policy looks like. You can achieve clean oceans in many different ways with very different societal outcomes, and I think that part of the issue is not being looked at. And that is an opportunity, I think, for an organization like IMBeR that has social scientists. There's attempts to try and connect the UN Decade for Ocean Science with the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, there's an attempt to connect a lot of big science with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in that attempt, there are, again, opportunities for more social analysis than currently takes place. I think there's an assumption, the underlying assumption that sound science leads to sound public policy, leads to favorable societal impacts. And that pathway is not that straightforward. So it gets complicated in the blue economy. The blue economy has multiple definitions and conceptions, and we're going to hear more about that later in the week. And for now, I just want to say that the blue economy is sometimes defined as just any maritime activity, any maritime sector industry, from shipping and seabed mining to coastal tourism, etc. But in its more sophisticated definitions, it's often thought of as reliant on ecosystem services. So what's distinct about it is it uses it's based on marine ecosystem services. So that takes out things like certain forms of sort of maritime transport and mining and things like that. Those may impact marine ecosystem services, but they're not reliant on it. But most definitions are somewhat inclusive, and they have these sustainable development ideas of conserving the environment, conserving the assets of natural capital in the sea, of using the resource efficiently to generate economic benefits, and some form of consideration for equity, employment and livelihoods and things like that. And it's that part, again, which is not that well articulated. But there's a huge enthusiasm from a range of organizations on this. So organizations like the OECD and FAO have got blue growth and blue economy prospectuses and policies. The Economist magazine has sort of got together with the private sector, the business community, and produced analyses of the blue economy's economic potential. And NGOs like WWF are on board as well, and developing a number of sort of financial instruments to support conservation. So these are all quite large and powerful organizations, and they're basically all aligned behind this idea of a blue economy, which is essentially we need to make to strengthen property rights in the ocean, to strengthen science as well, but to strengthen property rights so that the climate for investing in the blue economy is more secure for business, and that investment will then foster the next wave of economic growth. So it's establishing stronger property rights is seen by some as code for essentially privatizing what is currently a public or a global good. It's worth doing because it's extremely valuable. I think this analysis by WWF shows that ocean assets are worth $24 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. I can't quite figure out how many. But the question that I would ask is who owns or benefits from those assets? And how will a move towards a financialization of ecosystem services change the distribution of who benefits from those resources? A lot of the blue economy may seem sort of in the future or esoteric, but if we look at current blue economy type activities, and these are the sort of narrower definition here, a piece of work that's currently in progress. Renewable energy, blue carbon projects, bioprospecting, the development of large-scale and offshore mariculture, and of course, established industries like fishing and coastal tourism. But these are becoming more and more widely distributed, and what this analysis has done is take where the blue economy is at the moment and look at where it's developing. And we're seeing large-scale technological change at sea. Food from the sea initially was thought of in terms of expanding mariculture, but there are already ideas about offshoring food production as we run out of productive land, using large-scale solar-powered desalinization and growing crops offshore in floating farms like that. And similarly, aspirations for offshore energy. As you come into Europe these days and you look at the coastal waters, you see an increasing number of wind farms, and we're starting to work with tidal and wave energy as well. And that is also spreading around the world, although it remains small and expensive at the moment. If we're trying to develop the ideal blue economy, one that takes the 3 dimensions of sustainable development seriously, then the kind of overall frame for this is somewhat similar to this. Essentially, at the area where you've got the intersection between social equity and ecological function, you might have sustainable ecosystem approach to fisheries, for example, as one sort of example of that intersection. Social and economic attempts to advance equity with things like the small-scale fisheries guidelines produced by FAO, and ecological and economic sustainability, that's the area where really there's probably been the most work, and there you get things like blue growth and the carbon markets and the blue bonds in the Seychelles and so on. But what remains fairly elusive is the ability to combine all those three into the blue economy. And so Andres Cicernos Montemayor and colleagues, I'm one of the authors on this piece of work, have essentially tried to look around the world at the existing ocean economy and look at what potential is for marine ecosystem service-based economic activities in all the world's exclusive economic zones, and also looking at the capacity to govern and the degree to which equity objectives are likely to be met, and essentially developing a whole set of indicators to estimate the global blue economy capacity. And this is a very preliminary analysis of that basically shows that the areas where the blue economy is likely to develop fastest tend to be those around the developed economies, where the capacity to implement and benefit from ecosystem service monetization is already greater. And there will be inequities globally in terms of people's ability to develop this blue economy. So we're working to try and highlight that and to try to figure out how you address some of the governance deficits that will allow a more equitable distribution of benefits should this form of development take place. There are people, however, trying to oppose the blue economy, and the critiques come from small-scale fishermen's associations and also from civil society organizations, people focused on things like environmental justice. And the sort of cartoon at the top there depicts the well-known sort of idea that the rising tide of economic growth lifts all boats. And this one is a sort of somewhat skeptical view on that sort of economic credo. And there is this real concern that this is an ocean grabbing exercise, that this will dispossess the existing users of the ocean commons and simply enrich people who are already wealthy. Those with the capital to invest will get wealthier. Those without capital will be marginalized. And that's essentially the analysis, the influential analysis that French economist Thomas Piketty produced for the world economy a couple of years back. And work by Yuri Scholtens and others is now trying to extend this analysis into the ocean industries and to look at the potential consequences of a blue economy. Because what hasn't really been articulated is why should the pattern of economic growth proceed differently at sea to how it has on land? Why would we expect a different outcome when the sea is less well governed, more difficult to govern? Why would we expect a more equitable result from doing essentially what we've done on land? In which case, maybe we should be looking at alternatives. And that's the argument of organizations like the Transnational Institute, Global Social Justice Organization, that claim that a lot of this blue economy thinking is misguided and will lead to not to improved environmental governance and sustainability as hoped, but to increased depredation of marine resources and increased inequities. And there's good reason for having those fears. Inequalities of wealth and environment and of the impact that different kinds of people have on the environment has become a major topic of public policy. Some of the influential reports that Oxfam have produced, for example, sort of put out these rather startling statistics. The 85 richest people in the world who could comfortably fit on that luxury yacht there have the same amount of wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. And since then, that figure was produced a few years ago. Since then, that number has gone to now 8 people who can all fit, their latest graphic, can all fit in a golf cart, have the same amount of wealth as the 3.6 billion bottom poorest people in the world. So those levels of inequality are making people like the International Monetary Fund and others sort of stand up and think as well. And the South African Federation of Trade Unions have highlighted that at national level. So these discussions are taking place both at national and international levels, and even at the World Economic Forum in Davos, inequality has become a concern among the wealthy. We've also got inequality of impact. So if you think about this from an environmental justice point of view, who's impacting the environment? Well, the top 10% richest people in the world have emit half the CO2 associated with living. So there are inequities there as well. And I think unless we address these, then our chances of meeting the other sustainable development goals are limited. And there's not much in the moment in the blue economy and related work that claims to be helping society that directly addresses these issues. And we have inequality at sea as well. This is a piece of work that I was involved in that basically shows that if you look at who's fishing in the common heritage of mankind out there on the high seas, it's 5 countries, and they're all medium-high to high-income countries. And if you look at who's fishing in exclusive economic zones, rich countries fish their own exclusive economic zones, and in poorer countries, the rich countries fish them too. So there is inequity of access and availability of access to resources in fisheries already. And at the extreme level, these extreme disparities of wealth and power lead to violations of human rights in global seafood value chains. And the teams that I've been involved with have written quite a lot about this. It was originally a story that came to public attention through journalism, but an important example of how social research in a sector that was dominated by natural research has changed the picture and led to the socially responsible seafood movement, for example, and a whole group of NGOs now looking at social standards for sustainability as well as environmental ones in fisheries. So that's how research and reporting can change the conversation and change policy to address social ecological problems. These problems, of course, are not new, and science hasn't always been on the right side. So this question of, is science automatically in the service of the public good? Can you just accept those last 3 to 4 words of the IMBeR statement of saying, well, science for the good of society, and just carry on with your science and not worry about it? The answer is probably no. If you look at the history of science, a lot of marine science in particular, it's was in the service of colonial expansion and earlier than that, mercantile expansion. So this is the endeavor and the voyage of Joseph Banks. And if you look at the structure of the French academies and scientific system, it's very much tied with early Louis XIV era mercantile ambitions for France. And so all of the European colonial powers essentially have this very close linkage between their scientific establishment and their colonial past. And that's something that, that we're having to confront, I think. And the inequities that those events have produced live with us now. And it's one of the reasons why you saw blanks on that map about where people were coming from in any global scientific meeting. Oceanography, in particular, has been a strategic military science. A lot of it has been funded by the military, including this famous map of, gosh, I've forgotten her name. I should have written it on this slide. I've got it in my notes, but I can't read them, unfortunately. I think it's Maria Taub, is that right? Tharp, that's right, yeah. She was the cartographer working in the Columbia Earth Observatory who discovered the rift in the mid-Atlantic ridge and then subsequently all the others, and that helped advance plate tectonics. But the mapping of the seabed was essentially funded by the US Navy and the military, and a lot of oceanographic research has been militarily funded, including the search for hydrothermal vents and so on. So, research is often funded by the powerful to serve the interests of the powerful. And that's something that, one perhaps has to be aware of when going about doing research. It's not something that we can completely avoid, but it is something that you can take a position on and that you can reflect on and try and find ways of making science serve the wider public interest and not just the interests of the powerful. And the project that I'm working with the Nippon Foundation is headed by an anthropologist called Yoshi Ota. And there the emphasis is on the equity dimension of sustainability. And there's a whole set of processes and structures that aim to essentially challenge the sort of very close partnership between big science, big data, and big corporations and big powerful governments, because that way you simply get a reinforcement of the status quo. You don't get any sort of challenge to that. But we do have challenges to that around, including work done by people that you're going to hear from later in this week. Derek Armitage's book, Governing the Coastal Commons, looks at how social equity challenges are met in the way that we choose to govern coastal resources. And there's a whole sort of set of books that try to, and research going on that is beginning to address this equity dimension. So how do you get involved? Well, what do you do? If you study the global nitrogen cycle, or you look at mesoscale forcing in eastern boundary currents, what has equity and justice and all that kind of stuff got to do with what you do? Well, I think you're also citizens of the world, and I know that many of you, and particularly I think our younger generation of scientists, are very much more comfortable with navigating the interface between political action and scientific research. I think my generation and earlier were taught that science is a separate activity and should avoid as much engagement in politics as possible, and that scientists should be apolitical and neutral on social issues. Of course, they're not, and many of the most prominent scientists from Albert Einstein onwards have been very much involved in issues of peace and justice and other sort of major causes in the greater social good. So what can we do as IMBeR scientists to ensure that our science does indeed serve sustainability in all its dimensions? Well, you could read the IMBeR science plan. Who's read it, by the way? This is your moment where, scientists always tell the truth. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. It is worth reading. There's probably not as much on equity as there could be, but it's very good on linking how the kind of work that we all do links to better understandings and better decision-making with regard to sustainability. You can ask critical questions about whose interests your science serves. And that's just looking at where the funding comes from and doing a little bit of tracing. Follow your curiosity about that. Look at some of the history behind the fields that you've worked in. Look at some of the values held by the major practitioners and look to see where you can improve those. We've had great success, I think, in the scientific community at reducing things that plagued previous generations of scientists. Sexism, for example. You know, we have some way to go, but there's progress in those areas. So, you know, science can reflect and serve society better than it has done. Track the key social and ocean policy initiatives, figuring out how your science is being used, and then you can offer and work with correctives if you feel that it's being used to sort of promote an agenda that maybe moves away from sustainability or equity. Developing your positionality as a scientist and a member of society has become increasingly important. You have to develop a stand and a way of addressing the boundaries between your research, your actions and views as a private citizen, and your possibility to advocate for certain causes that you feel to be in the global good. And so that's an active reflection that many of us have not been trained how to do. And I think, you know, that's an area where if you have the opportunity to take courses on science and society or do some independent reading on that, then that's well worth doing, I think. It takes you on that path that Francois Houllier told us that, you know, it's increasingly important that we're competent in that sphere. And work across natural, social science, or humanities disciplines. So when you talk about interdisciplinarity or whatever, that doesn't mean, you know, a geochemist working with a biochemist. That's kind of, let's call that narrow interdisciplinarity. But it means, you know, working with a social anthropologist or a historian or a political scientist if you're a geochemist. If you're an anthropologist, maybe working with a microbial ecologist. There is an anthropological book on the tribe of people who study microbes in the sea. So these collaborations are possible. Do that at least once in your career. You don't have to be an interdisciplinary scientist to be successful or to be engaged, but I think that opportunity affords you a window into how others think, which makes you a broader, more critical, more rigorous thinker as well. So with those thoughts, if I can get the last slide. I'll just leave you with a positive thought that, you know, we're a community that connects. We come from different parts of the world. We come from across different oceans, and we often see society as a whole sees oceans as a way that divides different countries and peoples. And the ocean is the space that you cross to get from one place to the other. Many geographers have talked about this, social geographers, as, you know, the ocean is a sort of placeless place. It has no society, because society is largely based on land. Now, there are more maritime societies who see the sea very differently. Among those, the people of the Pacific Islands. And, you know, oceans can connect societies, and our common interest in sustaining the oceans is perhaps one means of reconnecting us in this increasingly fragmented and fractious world. So just as the sea is an open and ever-flowing reality, so should our oceanic identity transcend all forms of insularity and become one that is openly searching, inventive, and welcoming. So let's all try and be those things this week: searching, inventive, and welcoming. Thanks very much.
Thank you ever so much, Eddie. We have a couple of minutes if you're okay to take any questions from the floor. Does anyone have any questions for that very thought-provoking talk? We have people with microphones around the room. there's a question over there. Is that Marion?
Yeah.
Do we have a microphone close to Marion, please?
Thank you very much, Eddie, for that, including the alternative views on the graphics. You gave us the what can scientists do, brilliant. And at some point in the beginning, you mentioned required policies. What do they look like? And I kept thinking about that, and we want to continue talking about that during the week, but it would be nice to hear your view on that as well. Required policies in terms of social equity in the ocean realm.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that we're actively trying to work on at the moment, but the essential, simple message is that a global universalist, science-driven vision is unlikely to result in more equitable outcomes. I think that a lot of the decision-making on what kind of relationship people want with the ocean has to be devolved to the scales at which many of those relationships take place, which is within sovereign country boundaries, within local areas of jurisdiction, of traditional management, for example. And the accommodation is more difficult if you've got a multitude of governing mechanisms and a multitude of ways of deciding what kind of quality or health of ocean that you're willing to have, because you can't do that completely in isolation, because the ocean is fluid and mixed. So what you do has consequences on others. So it's a sort of classic problem of cross-scale governance and dynamics. And my sense at the moment is that the thinking is too high level around a lot of the policy and needs to come back down to the level at which individual societies negotiate their relationship with the sea within a framework that's set by these kind of international norms and standards, rather than all pursuing the path that, let's face it, the sort of developed Anglo-Saxon economies are the ones that are pushing this kind of policy most, and it fits most with their policy orientations on land. And if you look at what has happened to inequality and the relationship with growth over the last century, and this has been plotted out by numerous people, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, inequity has been increasing in the last 40 years, and in the rest of the developed world, inequities have been decreasing, have remained fairly steady, after decreasing in the early part of the 20th century. So the pathway that the Anglo-Saxon countries have followed economically is leading to rising inequality, particularly in those countries, more so than others. And that's the path that we seem to be promoting for the oceans.
Thank you, Eddie. I think we'll let you off the hook now. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to stick to time. Have another question.
Thank you, Eddie, for that really excellent, thought-provoking talk. I certainly think you make a good point that the path from science to policy is a very complex one that we need to think deeply about. And I was just interested in your comments on, particularly you talk about the blue economy and the sort of growing inequity that we have. And so where is the role of science in that? So we've certainly done a good job as scientists in coming up with some great research that I think helps us to optimize the sort of economic value from our fisheries, and this has led to some of this growing inequities. And we have a bit of a catch-up game to play in terms of considering some of the sort of social values and inequities. And in some ways, I mean, I would love to see the blue economy relabeled as the blue socio-economy, for example. So do you think that some of the sort of, for example, we heard about the Human Dimensions Working Group, do you think that's the kind of science that is going to help us to achieve a better balance going forward between the sort of social and economic?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're able to engage social scientists early on in developing joint research questions. I think what tends to happen is that an environmental impact is sort of identified through a natural science research project, and then potential solutions are developed or scenarios developed, and then at some point social scientists are engaged to say, well, which ones of these do you think might work, or what will the impacts be? But I think if you develop the questions and the joint work from the earlier stages of the research project, then it's more likely that you're going to get an analysis that allows you to explore, for example, through good scenario development, what the consequences of different ways of dealing with the problem are, because there is a path dependency to how you address a problem. I think sometimes people say, well, let's just get conservation going, let's get marine protected areas in, let's sort of try and use markets to secure blue carbon and so on, and then worry about the distribution of benefits afterwards. And I think you have to develop those ideas simultaneously because of that path dependence. And I think that early collaboration helps with that.
Thank you very much. Well, Eddie is going to be here all week, so I'm sure as we relax into the week, there'll be more questions at coffee and lunch times. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for preparing your talk. Thank you ever so much, Eddie, Allison.